Hi, I am dropping in today to share around the concept of grief and breath and lungs. I guess brief is putting grief and breath together into the same word there. And I wanted to talk about that concept today and talk about the idea of breath being impacted by the lungs, not only from a mechanical standpoint, but when grief is part of that, because the lungs are representative of grief from an organ standpoint. And if we haven't connected before, I'm Kelly Hale, and I have the joy of sharing ways for people to find the ease in life, to move through life more gracefully and easily with more comfort by sharing nervous system regulation tools. And I come at this with 25 years experience as an OT, a Pilates practitioner, a brain gym practitioner, and a nervous system regulation expert. So I've been talking recently about breathing and how there's a lot of components to breath that are missed. And I shared how early in my career, I would look a lot at the biomechanics of breath, what's going on with the ribs, what's happening with the muscles. And that's great. We still want to stay focused on that. But I brought a lot of other components to breath work in these last years. And in recent videos, I've talked about how if someone's in fight, flight, freeze, they're not going to be able to get into a place where breathing exercises are supportive. They can actually trigger them. So be sure to check out some of those videos. But today I want to talk about grief and the lungs. And as a visceral manual therapist, that means I work with gentle mobilization exercises, hands-on, that I do for people for their organs. And I also teach exercises for organ release. I've noticed some connections, and through these years serving people for 25-ish years now, I think it's getting on more than that, but I have noticed I've worked with so many people in their process of grief, whether it's losing a spouse or another very close family member, or losing a pet that was like a family member, or grief that can come up from loss of a role or a change in their life that feels pretty big. Grief is pretty powerful. And a lot of times I'll see it represented or show up in people differently. You know, some people come in and the grief is really rounding their body forward as if to protect them. Some people don't want to move when they're in grief. They don't move as well. And then when they come in and we start moving together very gently, they'll feel better. They feel like they can breathe a little bit. And early in my career, that was because we were just doing a healthy movement. But then I started to realize that if we did movement that helped him to just acknowledge that grief a little bit, to be present with that grief a little bit, because there's certain movements, developmental movements and reflex movements, that actually allow us to be in a moment with those heavy emotions, to be in that moment with those big emotions like grief. And if we do some gentle movements, it could be as simple as doing standing snow angel movements, for example, and then cycle through and do cross body movements, which bring us back to that integrated state after we've acknowledged the big emotions and intense emotions. This cycling through of moving through movements like a snow angel movement, and there are others that help us to process, acknowledge, touch on the grief, can be so powerful. And again, we always want to finish up with a contralateral or crossing the midline kind of movement. And I have various ways that I do that with people, even just a mat, sometimes using the Pilates apparatus. There's a lot of different ways we can touch on those different motions that are so important for acknowledging and integrating and moving through and processing intense emotions like grief. And then I also bring, as I mentioned, that organ work to it. So I might do a little hands-on gentle organ mobilization work for the lung area. But I also really love to empower people with exercises to support themselves. And just a few days ago, actually last Wednesday for the Work In Wednesday, I shared an exercise, a self-release, positional release for the left lung. Now, the left lung and the right lung are positioned differently in the chest cavity. So we're going to release those organs with different postural positioning and releasing. It's very simple movement if you go back and check out that exercise. So I showed how to release and open the left lung. And doing that before any movement practice, before expecting one to be able to breathe fully, whether it's in their yoga practice, their Pilates practice, or they're wanting to access some breathing exercises to find that peaceful parasympathetic state, doing an organ release or moving through particular developmental sequences that really acknowledge the lungs and the grief emotions that can be there. And other organs like the liver, where we have anger, because right there beside grief, we can have anger. It's not always neatly packaged as grief and grief alone. There can be anger. Maybe we need to support the frontonasal area, which is where we can have some of that sort of revved up limbic energy. So I also teach neurofascial processing, which is hands-on work. And I've shared some of that recently, and I have some more coming up, where you can actually process and move through some of that grief and help clear the lungs. And that's going to help facilitate greater ease with breathing as well. So I'm sharing this because I really take a multifaceted approach to breath work. It's not only structural and biomechanical that's important. It has a very developmental. I talked in the last few weeks about some reflexes that can be tripped up. And if they're not approached and integrated, that can get in the way. We could be stuck in fight, flight, freeze because those reflexes are tripped up. And that's going to impede ease around breath. And then today, just to recap, I'm talking about how grief can really impede our ability to breathe with ease because grief is represented in the lungs. So by doing organ releases positionally, like I shared last week in Workin' Wednesday, and also doing movements that allow us to move through and acknowledge and touch on that grief, can allow breath to come back to a place of ease and comfort and depth and support, which is so huge for moving forward in life. And if this is something that's interesting to you, check out those videos I've been sharing. I've really been on the topic of breath lately. I love to get on a topic and really share different facets of it. And I've had a lot of curiosity around this topic. So I actually have a workshop coming up, Embodied Breath. And it's all about accessing the nervous system regulation piece of breathing. And it's going to cover the emotional side of breath. It's going to cover the biomechanics. It's going to cover the idea of developmental movements to help you move through emotions that might be impeding your breath. I'd love to see you join us for this workshop. It's on the 11th at 6:30 Eastern Time, or you can definitely join via replay. And you can learn more about it and register at inspiredwell.com/embodied breath. And certainly feel free to drop any questions below. Again, my hope for you is that you'll look at breath from a more comprehensive viewpoint, something that takes into account the emotions, the nervous system, early developmental patterns, reflexes, the organs, because I feel that those are very often missing pieces in accessing our best breath. I know earlier in my career, I missed those components. And when I started to bring those in, the people that I would serve, that I was serving and continue to serve that have big experiences around grief are moving through recent, even longer term grief, but they still feel a lot of triggers towards it, or they're still processing, because remember, grief has no timeline and there's no set path. We each have to take the path that is best for us, but having our nervous system as part of that path can really help us move through that grief and access the deepest breath. So maybe someone you know or love, or in your own experience, your breath work may not be as beneficial because you haven't processed some of those older pieces of grief or even newer. So please feel free to drop your questions that you might have around this topic of a multifaceted nervous system regulation and organ approach to breathing. Feel free to drop any questions down below in the comments. And I love supporting your questions because sometimes it turns into a future topic for one of these or a quick video for my Workin' Wednesday. So please be sure to drop those questions. And again, if you're interested in the Embodied Breath Workshop, go to inspiredwell.com/embodied breath. I hope to see you there, or hope to see you next time on one of these. Thanks for watching.